In the early 2010s, a category of films popped up that Disney accidentally created, a category I like to call the failed next big thing. These are movies that Disney dumped a lot of money and advertising into in order to start a new film franchise. And with most of these films, it was trying to recapture the magic and success that the Pirates of the Caribbean films captured. There's tons of these films that were pushed everywhere in the hopes that they would catch on, but when audiences didn't really react, they were tossed away, never to be thought of again. At one point, Disney was trying everything in their power to make these films happen. But once they failed, they tried everything in their power to make us forget. There are many of these films that I've already covered, such as Tomorrowland and The Sorcerer's Apprentice, so check out the playlist in the description to see those. But for today's video, we are focusing on 2012's John Carter. So let's take a look at this forgotten failure and try to understand why it never spawned the franchise that Disney hoped it would, and how it became one of the company's biggest box office flops. The original idea for this film can actually be traced back over 100 years. In 1912, Edgar Rice Burroughs published his massively influential science fiction novel, A Princess of Mars. This book and its subsequent series tells the story of an American Civil War veteran by the name John Carter, who is transported to the surface of Mars, where he becomes entangled in the affairs of the local alien population. This series was super influential to the science fiction genre, as it gave inspiration to many iconic writers such as Ray Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke. We wouldn't have huge franchises like Star Wars, Dune, and Avatar today if it weren't for this book and its impact. So naturally, an adaptation of this story on the big screen has been brewing for a long time. There's been many attempts at a film adaptation throughout the years that have all failed for various reasons. In the late 1930s, Looney Tunes director and producer Bob Clampett tried his hand at creating a feature-length animated adaptation, but the test footage received negative reactions from audience members who deemed the story too outlandish for the time. This statement is pretty ironic because the Flash Gordon movie serial came out at the same time and was a huge hit, which is a series that drew a lot of inspiration from The Princess of Mars. In the 1980s, there was another attempt at an adaptation, and Disney even bought the rights to the story. However, plans for this project were dropped when the filmmakers realized that visual effects were not advanced enough to create the world that was needed to tell the story. After sitting on the rights for a while, the rights eventually returned to Burroughs' estate. In the early 2000s, Paramount Pictures took a stab at an adaptation and purchased the rights to the story. This iteration went through various screenwriters and directors, with it eventually ending up in the hands of Jon Favreau. However, after spending too much time in production hell, Paramount decided not to renew the film rights, and Jon Favreau went to direct a movie called Iron Man for Disney instead. Hopefully it worked out for him. When the rights went up for sale again, director Andrew Stanton pushed Disney to buy the rights to the story just one more time. Disney bought the rights and the adaptation finally found a home, nearly 100 years after the first book came out. Andrew Stanton had a solid track record with Disney, having made classics such as Finding Nemo, WALL-E, and A Bug's Life. Stanton was a huge fan of the story and convinced the House of Mouse to let him helm the project. It was a bit of an uphill battle for him for several reasons. Stanton had never made a live-action film before, the screenplay was deemed confusing, and he wanted to cast unknowns as the main actors in the film. However, since he had pumped out iconic films before, he was approved by the higher-ups. The script was finalized in 2009 and casting went underway. Sticking by his word, Stanton casted more unknown actors rather than big names. Taylor Kitsch was set to play the title character, and Lynn Collins was casted as Deja Thoris. Various big-name actors such as Willem Dafoe and Bryan Cranston were brought on to round out the rest of the cast, and the film was finally ready to go into production. After decades upon decades of trying to get this film made, it was finally happening, and with the talented cast and crew attached as well. Things were looking up for this potential franchise. Principal photography kicked off in the January of 2010. While in production, the film ran into a handful of other problems. To make a long story short, the actual production was expensive. There were lots of scenes that required intensive special effects with large spaceships and creatures, and many of the characters were fully CGI. They shot a lot of these types of scenes in a studio in England, rather than on location, which reportedly was not the greatest decision for several reasons. Cinematographer Dan Mindel had this to say about the experience in an article done by The Wrap. A lot of the studio work that we had done was so compromised because of the choice of studio. The size of the stages, the fact that it was all inside when it should have been outside, all that kind of stuff. Ultimately, your hands are tied when you're in a flying ship that is supposed to be open to the elements flying through the air in broad daylight, and you're in a studio in the middle of winter in the UK. It's impossible to make those things feel texturized and part of a real environment. I think that it really suffered for that. And when they filmed on location in the deserts of Utah, they were hit with harsh sandstorms, which brought their own host of problems. However, even with all these factors, the original shoot wasn't a disaster or went way over budget. But that all changed when they previewed the rough cut of the film. It seemed like this first cut of the film was not up to Disney's standards, because a year after principal photography finished, the film crew went back out to do extensive reshoots. Allegedly, they had to reshoot much of the movie twice, and add in a ton of scenes in order to make it easier to follow, which was one of the biggest problems the script faced in early pre-production. Also, during this reshooting phase, a writer by the name of Tad Friend visited the set and wrote a story about his time on set for The New Yorker called Second Act Twist. We'll speak more about this New Yorker piece a bit later because it has an important footnote in this film's legacy. Overall, these reshoots were not as smooth as the original principal photography, and made the budget of this film balloon to a much higher number than it was originally supposed to have. And post-production of this film ended up being just as daunting of a task. The workload of special effects that this film needed was massive, especially the plethora of shots that included hundreds of 12-foot tall, fully CGI aliens. In the Wrap article, Stanton had this to say about the post-production process. We were basically making two movies. So much of it was visual effects, it was basically making 2/3 live action and 1/3 an animated movie, full on. There were more animated shots in what was left to do on Carter than an entire animated feature. Also, during this stage in production, the decision was made to change the title to just John Carter, rather than call the film The Princess of Mars or even John Carter of Mars. This was a controversial decision to both fans of the source material and the filmmakers themselves, but even after all these troubles, the film finally made it to theaters in 2012, and even 100 years after the first book was released. This was just a quick summary of the making of this film. If you want to learn more, I definitely recommend checking out the article by The Wrap that I mentioned. Link will be in the description along with a few others. Now that we know the background of the production, we can move on to the reception of this film. And I'm sure you know where this is heading. John Carter premiered March 9th, 2012 to an opening weekend gross of $30 million. It was second in the box office, right behind Illumination's The Lorax. Now, there's been a running theme in these videos that Disney properties are always failing because they hit theaters at the same time Despicable Me and its sequels did. Although The Lorax is not in the Despicable Me verse, it's still made by Illumination Studios, so I'd count it as close enough.
You greedy dirtbag!
Throughout its run in the United States, John Carter grossed $73 million total. Overseas, it made $211 million for a final box office gross of $284 million. With a budget of $307 million, not including marketing, that meant that this movie was a certified bomb. And in fact, the biggest box office bomb in history. It lost the company an estimated $250 million. The reviews for this film were pretty mixed, with it leaning mostly on the negative side. The film currently holds a 52% critic and a 60% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, along with a score of 2.7 stars out of 5 on Letterboxd. Most of the criticism focuses on the uneven pacing and the incomprehensible plotting and characterization. Since the film ended up being the biggest box office bomb in movie history, obviously the plans for the potential sequels were dropped pretty quickly. Contrary to most movies on this list, the movie wasn't forgotten, but rather it gained infamy over the years. When we think of box office bombs, we think of John Carter. So in that respect, the film has a bigger legacy than anything else I've covered on this list so far. But that of course begs the question of why it bombed so hard, and exactly what went wrong.
I suggest you come peaceably. Do you now?
The failure of John Carter has been analyzed many times by many different people, which means that there's a lot of theories floating around on the internet. As is the case with most films, we can't point at one thing that caused this film to crash, but rather it's a combination of poor choices that resulted in the bomb. But with John Carter, I subscribe to the theory that this film was doomed on arrival. It wasn't given the chance to perform well at the theaters because it was written off as a failure before it even came out. Remember the article I talked about earlier by Tad Friend called Second Act Twist? This article basically covered the on-set troubles that John Carter was facing during its reshoot phase. Nowadays, reshoots and additional photography are pretty common with major blockbusters, as it happens all the time with MCU movies. But in 2011, reshoots were very uncommon and often showed indecisiveness on set and that the film was running into major trouble. Tad Friend's article was posted on October 10th, 2011, which was about 6 months before the film was released. This means for the following 6 months in anticipation of the film's release, all people ever talked about was about how the film was doomed and about how Disney poured way too much money into it. Similar to what happened to 2015's The Lone Ranger, this film received so much bad press before people even had a chance to watch it. And when the public is told that a film is a failure for 6 months straight, then they are likely not going to see that film in theaters. The marketing campaign for John Carter didn't do the film any favors. This was obvious by the first trailer. In this trailer, there was oddly no mention of the creatives behind the movie. This was a huge misstep because they could have used Stanton's successful background creating classic films for Pixar to help sell audiences on this film. Also, the choice was made not to include the legacy and impact that John Carter of Mars has had on science fiction. They didn't bother to mention that this series inspired Star Wars and Dune and Avatar. You could have at least mentioned that the original writer of John Carter, Edgar Rice Burroughs, also wrote Tarzan. But no, that wasn't included either. This first trailer also didn't include the exciting visuals and big action set pieces that are usually utilized to hook audiences right off the bat. Rumors say this is because the filmmakers didn't have enough finished special effects to put in the trailer, but Stanton said this wasn't the case. So, the criticism of the lack of action in the first trailer was noted, and it seemed like the marketing team overcorrected, because the second trailer was basically only action. This trailer also proved to be pretty underwhelming for the general audience. Claude Brodesser-Akner from Vulture had a great observation on the failure of the second trailer in their article titled "The Inside Story of How John Carter Was Doomed by Its First Trailer." Here's a quote. "This more frantic trailer reveals the most problematic part of John Carter, and possibly why it was doomed to underperform no matter what happened. Because the Barsoom books were so influential as cinema's greatest sci-fi auteurs, just about everything in it had already been plundered and reused by other hits. As a result, the more that was revealed of John Carter, the more derivative it looked, even if the source had originated these ideas." Just as Brodesser-Akner pointed out, everything we see in the trailer is stuff we've seen hundreds of other times in other films. Although the John Carter series was the first to come up with this kind of stuff, only fans of the original books know this, while the general audience doesn't. In this same article, a former studio marketing chief said this about John Carter: "This is one of the worst marketing campaigns in the history of movies. It's almost as if they went out of their way to not make us care." These trailers were so bad that die-hard John Carter fans decided to make their own fan-made trailer for the film. And honestly, it's pretty good. I'll link it in the description along with my other references. They actually included Stanton's past of other successful Pixar films and noted John Carter's influence on the science fiction genre. Why these original trailers didn't connect this film to other major franchises it has influenced is beyond me, especially since the average consumer today isn't familiar with the original John Carter from Mars books, as I stated before. This is another reason why this film didn't do so well, is that the franchise doesn't have the same pop culture currency that it had 80 years ago. And this is largely because this movie was the first major adaptation of the story we've ever seen on the big screen. There was a 2009 direct-to-DVD movie, but that doesn't really count. You can actually find that whole movie on YouTube for free if you feel like torturing yourself for 90 minutes. I largely blame Disney for the failure of this film, although some blame can also be put on Andrew Stanton. I think he overestimated how popular the Princess of Mars book was, because his insistence on casting unknowns for the leads definitely hurt this film's mass appeal. Also, this was Stanton's first ever live-action film that he directed, which is a lot of pressure given the huge budget and scope of the film. I don't think he should have been thrown into such a huge film for his first live-action movie, and that's also on Disney for giving him the green light. I do believe he was the right guy to direct this, since he had so much love for the source material, but I think he should have directed a few smaller live-action films before jumping into something this huge. I wish Stanton would have had another chance at making a film in this universe, because I'm sure he would have learned from the mistakes made on this film. But I guess we'll never know. Now, if you want to put your tinfoil hats on, we can get into some more interesting and controversial theories. Perhaps John Carter bombing was an inside job. Stay with me. In the summer of 2011, unbeknownst to the creative team behind John Carter, Disney CEO Bob Iger had begun negotiations with George Lucas to purchase Lucasfilms. By this time, John Carter was already in post-production, so the damage was already done in regards to the overspending. John Carter was originally supposed to be Disney's response to Star Wars. However, just a few months after John Carter was released, the deal to purchase Lucasfilm was finalized. This means that Disney owned Star Wars and didn't need to compete or respond to it. So, a conspiracy theory that has been floating around is that Disney purposely sabotaged the release of John Carter so they wouldn't have two competing properties being released at the same time and they could go all in on Star Wars. This explains the terrible marketing campaign and why Disney was so quick to call it a failure. Just look at the lack of merchandising leading up to this film's release compared to other attempted blockbusters like the Prince of Persia movie. Of course, this is just a conspiracy theory, but I'll let you decide on whether it has any merit to it or not. I don't want to present this conspiracy as a fact.
Enough. You want me to jump again? I'm not gonna jump.
I actually really enjoyed this movie. It's not amazing by any means, but it didn't deserve to bomb as hard as it did. What I appreciate about this film the most is that you can tell it was made with love. Andrew Stanton put his heart and soul into this project, and that results in a movie that feels authentic and shows respect to the source material. It's difficult to judge this movie in hindsight because you could call a lot of the aspects in this film derivative and cliche. There's stuff in this film that we've already seen in tons of other blockbusters like Avatar and Star Wars, but this film is an adaptation of the books that inspired Avatar and Star Wars. So although John Carter came out after these movies, it technically did it first. Taking this into account, you have to consider whether you can call this film cliche and derivative. Should this film have done some aspects differently to not fall into these cliches, or should it have stayed close to the source material like it did? I think that question is up to the viewer to decide because I'm personally split on the matter. I really enjoyed the world building in this series, and it was awesome to see just how much of the story has influenced modern science fiction. It was particularly interesting to see how much the Dune series borrowed from John Carter, as you could draw a lot of parallels between those two franchises. The action in this movie is really fun, and the special effects were well done. It definitely feels like this movie cost $300 million, as there is a lot of huge action set pieces with a lot of expensive CGI. All the stuff that dealt with the Thark is what I found the most interesting, and the CGI on those characters was very well done. Willem Dafoe gave a great performance as usual, and it was great to learn more about the Thark culture through him. This film isn't as bad as a lot of the reviews at the time made it out to be. I think with a lot of these reviews, people were influenced by the bad press leading up to the film's release, and that made these reviews more critical than they really should have been. However, there is some truth to these reviews, and I want to add some of my own criticism and gripes I have with this movie. Really, the weakest parts of this movie was the very beginning and ending when we were on Earth. Those scenes on Earth were a mess, and the story didn't really kick into gear until we got to Mars. But once we got to Mars and the movie was able to flex its interesting world building and characters, then it actually became enjoyable. The whole framing device with the nephew back on Earth was very unnecessary, and I felt like it made the film more complicated than it already was. It seemed very tacked on and didn't mix with the rest of the story very well. They could have just cut those scenes from the beginning and end, and it would have made the film much more streamlined. Additionally, I felt like our main character wasn't as strong and fleshed out, which sucks because the film is riding on him and the movie is literally named after him. He's a pretty by-the-numbers action protagonist and ends up feeling pretty generic and boring. Throughout the film, we see very brief flashbacks of our hero's tragic backstory, but they are so short and sporadic that they weren't as effective as they should have been. I felt like there should have been a few more slow scenes where we could really get more insight into his past and he could have opened up more, but those types of scenes never really happened, or if they did happen, they were brief and brushed over so quickly. I wasn't the biggest fan of Taylor Kitsch's performance. I'm sure he's a great actor and this was largely down to the writing, but when the main character is the most boring one in the story, then that's a bad sign. His accent was pretty ridiculous to me and the character just isn't engaging.
Captain John Carter, Virginia.
It felt like for a majority of the film, he was just responding to things that happened to him rather than pushing the plot through his own actions. He wasn't a very active protagonist until the third act, then he started to come into his own. but the lack of any romantic chemistry with Lynn Collins' character also didn't do his character any favors. It seems to be a common theme among these failed Disney franchises that the romance plot is always half-assed. Honestly, Lynn Collins' character, Deja, was one of the highlights of the film, as I found her much more interesting than John. But even with all these criticisms, I still enjoyed the film much more than I thought I would, and it's probably been my favorite I've covered in this series so far.
The company under your command nearly turned the tide.
It sucks that this film bombed as hard as it did, because I would have liked to see a sequel. They were definitely setting up the sequels at the end of this film, but we'll never get to see what those might have looked like. This franchise had so much potential, but Disney dropped the ball, which resulted in their biggest box office bomb of all time. Due to months of bad press, a terrible marketing campaign, and the film being written off as a failure before people even got a chance to see it, John Carter was added to the collection of Disney's fumbled franchises. It's a solid science fiction movie, and if the budget was smaller and the marketing campaign was better, then maybe we would have a sequel right now. That's the long and complicated story of 2012's John Carter, Disney's failed next big thing. What are your thoughts on this movie? I would love to hear them in the comments below. This has been Tom from Eisenhart Productions, and thank you so much for watching. See you next week.